I'm very, very pleased to be able to present Ananya, Professor Ananya Kabir, to you, and she's going to give her dance lecture or music lecture on improvisation and the cramp of time. I'd just like to say a very few words about Ananya. I looked at her blog yesterday evening, and the first sentence is absolutely incredible, and so I have to read it out to you. She says, I am a literary and cultural historian. Okay, sorry. Yes, I should do, shouldn't I? Yeah? Okay. Ananya says in her blog, and I quote, I am a literary and cultural historian who works at the intersection of embodiment, memory, affect work, and post-trauma in the global south, so as to re-examine the regime and pleasures of modernity. And I had to read it again and again, and I thought, this is absolutely wonderful. This is so rich. And what Ananya has managed to do in this one sentence is to reduce so many complex thoughts and ideas with a full stop at the end. Anyway, Ananya is originally from India, but I guess she has danced her way through all the continents of the world.
Except Antarctica.
Except Antarctica. Well, you can skate there. Picking up music and rhythms and dancing to the beat of happiness, because I know she's a very happy person. I've read about her, and every time I meet her, she is always smiling. And she writes another sentence which I think is very, very beautiful. She says, boundaries confine us to safe spaces, but she left these safe spaces in order to go out and conquer the world, which she obviously has done in many, many different ways. She began by studying, well, first of all in India, but then went to Oxford, where she learned Old English and translated Old Norse poetry. This is an incredible beginning for someone who then ends up dancing in Commonwealth Studies conferences. Then she went to Cambridge, University of Berkeley, University of Leeds, where she taught, wrote books, read and did research, and then moved to King's College, London. And she received a wonderful European research grant, which belongs to her project, which is called Modern Moves. She speaks, by the way, English, Bengali, Hindi, German, French, Spanish, and Portuguese.
Most of those very badly.
We can't believe that. But so I'm going to give the floor to Ananya, not take up any more time here, and I'll sit down there and come back and see you later. Thank you, Ananya.
Thank you, Liz. And thank you, everybody, for being here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Oviedo, and this is, of course, a very significant and prestigious moment to launch my work in the form of this talk. It belongs to a chapter that I hope to write in a book at some point, so it's very, very new. And, so there may be some gaps. That's what conference talks are about. So thank you for that generous introduction, and I feel a good vibe in the room, which is fantastic, so let's go. There are lots of quotes, which in the interest of time, I may not read through, but that's why the PowerPoint is there, so we'll kind of riff between what I'm saying and what the quotes are saying, and there'll be some videos too, and it looks like the tech is working, so fingers crossed. Okay, so I include myself as a white dancer who heard the first strains of the machixe and the tango. Machixe, by the way, is a Brazilian dance, the ancestor, if you like, of samba. I include myself as a white dancer who heard the first strains of the machixe and tango, who saw the cakewalk danced at a grand society ball in faraway Russia. I pranced two-step and one-step during the First World War, and I saw Josephine Baker invade Paris. This was my music, my dance. New York was my home. Thus wrote Muraden in the foreword to From the Horse's Mouth, a book meant to chronicle the history of jazz dance in the United States through the words and movements of a number of her African-American friends, interlocutors, and fellow dancers. The book was never written, though an accompanying documentary film, The Spirit Moves, was finally made. Its drafts and her other writings on dance are preserved in the New York Public Library, and it's from this archive that I draw the material for my talk today. Mostly undated typewritten sheets in over 20 archive boxes, they attest to Muraden's absorption in the world of African American social dance, to which she had moved increasingly closer until she actually found herself in New York in 1930. And she says, I wanted to come home. Not in the document I'm reading from, but in another interview, she says, I wanted to come home, repeating the sentiment that opens the book that never was. I wanted to come home to be within my own land of dance. I was waiting to come. So what does Muraden's passion for jazz dance tell us about performing the urban, embodiments, inventories, rhythms, the theme of our convergence today? Born in Russia in 1902, Miss Dane had danced in the high society balls of St. Petersburg and Vienna, and had learned ballet and modern dance after the style of Jacques Dalcroze and Isadora Duncan. In 1925, in pursuit of a dance career, she saw Josephine Baker dance in Paris. Despite Paris being a haven for black dance in the interwar years, and that deserves a whole different paper, so I'm not going there today, Muraden decided to travel to New York to immerse herself in the world that she had glimpsed through Baker and other jazz dancers in Paris. Like Baker, she invaded the clubs of Harlem in uptown New York, observing, filming, dancing with, and talking to the dramatis personae, the hep cats and cool cats who wore zoot suits, spent hours practicing steps with their partners in small Harlem apartments, and turned up every night to outdo each other in dance to live jazz music by greats such as Duke Ellington, Chick Webb, Count Basie, and Louis Armstrong. The subjects of Dane's admiration and gaze were black. She, like many other jazz dance aficionados, was white. The world of dance she entered was, in her formulation, my own land, their own land. Something about jazz dance made Dane feel it as a universal need that broke through the world of racial segregation and the dark history of slavery that was still very much present in the memories and lives of Harlem's dancers. Shouldn't Dane's approach to black dance be castigated as cultural appropriation? I argue for a more nuanced approach to this phenomenon of white folks watching black dance. Dane once declared, jazz dance liberates us from the cramp of our tempo. This is the phrase from which I take my title. I will show how jazz's reliance on improvisation offered her and others deep and indeed shared resources for what they, at this time, considered the debilitating temporalities of capitalist and urban modernity. By the 1920s, American dances such as the cakewalk, foxtrot, Charleston, and black bottom had entered Europe, and the young Muraden had tried them out while still in Russia. But it was in Paris that she first saw authentic jazz dance, thanks to none other than the Black Pearl, the clever, funny, talented, and sexy Josephine Baker, whom she describes as possessing an extraordinary beauty of her body, the incredible humor of her limbs, the savage playfulness of her spirit. Some of that is quoted in that in the excerpt there. From this initial exposure to Baker, Dane took away some lessons, but let's see a bit of Baker first. right. So, what kind of lessons did Muraden take away from this sort of live performance that she would have seen? Lessons, I would say, of the humorous and ironical quality of jazz dance, as well as its vitality and kinetic virtuosity. What she calls, and we'll return to this phrase later, its determined élan vital, all of which struck her as precisely those elements that the European avant-garde was seeking earnestly through its rediscovery of what she calls, in that foreword to the horse's mouth, rhythm, natural movements, improvisation, and folk humor. And that's the genres that she had in her mind, as did her colleagues in the avant-garde, were like commedia dell'arte and other folk forms. And she talks about how in Europe there was a determined attempt to kind of excavate those forms and somehow marry them to what she calls the new theatre, to supplant the state forms, to express the revolutionary reality, to create, indeed, a popular theatre, unquote. So this is what everybody was looking for. And what Dane witnessed in Paris was, when she saw Josephine Baker, what she felt was precisely that which was needed. It was in her dance. But what she saw in Paris was a single black woman performing on stage for her mostly white spectators. So she sensed that more insights perhaps would arrive from dance as an organic social event if she moved to New York, where the source of the dance was. And that's indeed what she did, to experience for herself the temple of jazz dance, the Savoy Ballroom in the heart of Harlem. So let me just remind you of what Harlem at this point represented. In the words of scholar, very important dance scholar of African-American vernacular dance, Brenda Dixon Gottchild, she says, principally due to the ideals and savvy enterprise of a black real estate broker, Philip A. Payton, African Americans were allowed residency in Harlem in the 1910s and were offered their first chance to live in modern apartment houses. What was to happen to this community by the advent of the swing era was the phenomenal and paradoxical. Harlem became both the magnet for whites seeking exotic pleasures and for blacks seeking freedom from white dominance. Harlem, therefore, became the black capital and the black entertainment center of the nation and a microcosm of New York City itself. And Gottchild then quotes one of the dancers of that period, Margaret Webb, who said, quote, "You didn't go downtown. Everything was uptown," which is Harlem, of course. So the nerve center of this microcosm was the Savoy Ballroom, the legendary home of happy feet, and in the pre-civil rights era, quoting Gottchild again, a contact zone that ignored class distinctions, as well as a site where African-American and white worlds touched and merged momentarily. And we can indeed see this touching and merging in the very form of the dance that was going on in the Savoy. Unlike the Apollo and Cotton Club, other very famous clubs in Harlem, there, black dancers performed for an exclusively white spectatorship. But at the Savoy, black people danced for each other. Those white people, such as Muraden, who came to dance as much as watch. Here, she then found finally the happy embodiment of all this painful search. Let's see some reminiscence of the Savoy in the words of one of its most famous Lindy hopping dancers, Frankie Manning. Okay, so this is what she saw And this is what she described as the happy embodiment of all this painful search, her search for that something that she was drawn to all the way from Russia now to New York. In the Savoy Ballroom, she says, rhythm and movement, rhythm and freedom of movement, improvisation and humor were alive like in the times of the Dionysian festival or of Italian comedy. Satyrs and harlequins were actual and spontaneous, not a recreation, but a creation stemming from the same folk current which animated the great times of antiquity. Now, we can really unpick all this, but no time for all that. I just want to say that her characterization of what she saw in the Savoy as Dionysian was actually shared by many African-American commentators too. So it's not that she was romanticizing it, this feeling of something eruptive, something collective, something exhilarating but not necessarily sexualized, but not necessarily, unlike Bacchus, connected with wine and alcohol, because this was also the Depression, there was prohibition, etc. But you were using that energy of the body. So this was really not a very romantic, I think, imagination. It was pretty much putting into words of a certain spirit, which she herself calls the spirit that moves, later in the documentary film that she makes. So what was going on in the Savoy? What you saw was the dance, the Lindy Hop, and when we saw Josephine Baker dance, that was the Charleston. So there were many jazz dances that were fomenting and bubbling, if you like, at this time, around the turn of the century, and all these different sources came together in this magnificent dance, the Lindy Hop, which was really pretty much located in the Savoy. The Savoy was its temple. And I would characterize Lindy Hop as basically a partner dance. So it's a couple dance. There has to be a connection between two people. That connection can be loose or just frame to frame, or conducted through a handheld, holding each other's hands or whatever. But there has to be a connection between two. And it's characterized also, I would say, by a Dionysian exhilaration. It's very athletic. It's a very athletic kind of a dance. And Lindy Hoppers performed extraordinary feats of athleticism during this time and rivaled each other with their partners to create more and more crazy aerial steps and, feats of the body, which were also feats of partnership, because you had to have trust and complicity between the partners to be able to do that with each other in an improvised frame. Somebody like Dixon Gottschalk has analyzed very closely the Africanist impulses of the Lindy Hop, and I'm just going to go through them very quickly, quoting her really. She says these impulses or these features of Africanist aesthetics that you can find in the Lindy Hop are embracing the conflict. And this is embodied in the fact that it's a partner dance, but it's not like the tango, for example, or other kinds of partner dances where things seem to be very smooth and flowing. The Lindy Hop consists of lifts and moves that look as though a dancing couple was engaged in combat. Two dancing bodies negotiating common ground and embracing the encounter of their difference. Another point, high affect juxtaposition, an intense degree of contrast, the black dancing body engaged in a non-linear, non-narrative movement experience through a radical juxtaposition of affects. Third point, what she calls ephebism, the full force of individual drive, attack, vitality, and flexibility. Rhythm, timing, vital flashes of innovation. And this is a youthfulness, which also Muradin points out and calls... we can have it back again. She calls it that élan vital. Of course, all this is coming through what we call polyrhythm, timing principles derived from African time signatures, polyrhythm, counter-rhythm, cross-rhythm, syncopation. We'll return to these issues later. But I'm just enumerating what dance scholars have found in the Lindy Hop that answer to these Africanist aesthetics. And finally, of course, most importantly, the aesthetics of the cool. So you have to be cool. Even though you're like sweating it out, you have to be cool. Otherwise, there's no point of the Lindy Hop. And so these are characteristics which Muradin understood well. As she observes, the essence of jazz is vitality, is virility. I don't think she means here particularly masculinity, but something that's vital. It's transformation. Every beat and step contain the germ of the next one. Every vibration is charged with potential explosion. And I'm going to show you a little bit of a very famous clip of the Whitey's Lindy Hoppers. They were a famous Lindy Hopper troupe that then kind of presented themselves to the world of Hollywood and so on. But just because these are on screen, it doesn't, I think we can imagine the Lindy Hoppers actually dancing like this in the Savoy. And try to listen to what they're saying as well at this point, if you can. I really think it's worth seeing the whole thing because, you know, we have to pay homage to this stuff. Okay, I think that was pretty incredible, and we got a good idea of what all this is about. So this is a sort of dance that she was watching, trying to also learn, interviewing a lot of dancers about what were the principles of this dance, how did we come about it. And from their words and her constant immersion in this world, she wrote in her archives, basically, there are some repeated observations about what is the structure of jazz dance, what is the basis of jazz dance. And the two words that constantly recur are really, the first is improvisation. So this is for her like just absolutely an incredible principle to absorb, that people are improvising all the time. They're improvising steps, they're improvising sequences, they're improvising the entire dance, and yet, you know, they are in conversation with each other, with the crowd, and the music, which is also live at this point. So, you know, it's a crazy synthesis of different energies which seem to be in danger of exploding, she uses that word a lot, but always somehow converge at moments just when you least expect it. So she talks a lot about the basis of jazz being improvisation, and she's very insistent on that. There are some quotes here that you can read as I'm talking. But the next thing, I mean, in a sense, how do you improvise? There has to be a structure. I mean, you cannot just improvise away, especially in a couple dance, where you have to also have a split-second communication between two people doing all these crazy things which can endanger your life and your physical health. But you are fine. You're falling, leaping up, holding the other person, doing crazy things again. So how are they managing this? What is the magic? Well, it's really that this improvisation is based on the other thing, the other word that is very frequently in her vocabulary, rhythm. So you have to understand rhythm in a particular way. And there again, there is a lot of discussion in her, like, over 500 or 600 pages of typewritten notes about how you have to have a particular relationship to the beat. It's not just that. It's not just about rhythm and improvisation. The way the two lock together to produce jazz music and dance is you have to have a special relationship to the beat, to the offbeat, to the space between beats. You have to understand the silence. You have to move in between and around. And it's not just her. If people remember Paul Gilroy's very subtle discussion of Ralph Ellison in his book, Black Atlantic, there is a similar quotation from Ellison about how you have to slip in between. You slip into the night and you slip between the beats. And, there's all this kind of coming and going and moving agilely around the beat. That is the way rhythm is managed and responded to in jazz dance. And therefore, there is a kind of interdependence, a deep interdependence of rhythm and improvisation, which indeed gives her the confidence to say what she says in that statement that I've picked up. Jazz liberates us from the cramp of our tempo. It is through this interdependence of improvisation and rhythm that jazz dance can give us some resources which, according to her, are accessible to all who can understand that language, who take the time to enter that space and that world, to be liberated, and to be liberated from nothing else or nothing less than the cramp of our tempo. So here we come to the question, what indeed is the cramp of our tempo? What is she talking about, What does she indicate when she uses this phrase? To understand how and why jazz liberates, we need to understand what she means. What she senses is the malaise of her times, and which is rendered here in this very physical and kinetic phrase, the cramp of our tempo. It's the cramp, it's like our body, and we're talking about dance, so it's kind of appropriate, but what is going on? So I see this phrase, the cramp of our tempo, as originating from a rather widespread obsession with rhythm that characterizes the early decades of the 20th century. And this is not rhythm as an abstracted notion, but rhythm as sedimented in work and manifested in repeated motions. So let's just have a look at something that we may all know but may have forgotten. Because okay, I think we got the gist of that. I mean, it's all out there on YouTube, so, if you feel like revisiting it, which I really recommend, I think, for all of us, do so. What I'm trying to say through this clip is basically this obsession with rhythm around this time, precisely that the Lindy Hop was emerging and taking over Harlem and the world of black dance and dance in general, is that this obsession with rhythm was an urban experience. It was the rhythm of work in the city, intensified by the amplification of sensory impressions that technological developments were enabling in every sphere of daily life, but particularly the sonic. And this period actually coincides with the birth and commercialization of the microphone as well. So I really mean amplification. This rhythm in the early 20th century was being widely understood as not merely work, but a very specific kind of labor, repetitive factory work, which had restructured temporality as fundamentally as had the switch from sacred to secular time, which has been commented on, for example, by Jacques Le Goff. And that happened like in the transition from the late medieval to modern time, and now we are in modern times, where this has intensified into being the overarching temporality that we experience as modern subjects. And the film Modern Times, in my reading, I really have to look at it closely, but I'm very happy I started doing it for this talk. It satirizes the euphoric presentation of rhythm as work, which had actually been part of this consolidation of capitalist modernity. And this euphoria around rhythm as work, as repetitive work, can be seen in another kind of dance phenomenon. Okay, we'll end with that instance of the male gaze, just to throw it in there. But basically, what I'm trying to, again, bring back to our collective memory here is the chorus line, And as the song and dance sequence from the film Gold Diggers illustrates perfectly, there was a convergence, actually, of capitalist fantasies and flawless rhythmic repetition. The main thing about this form of rhythmic expression is uniformity and predictability. There's no point in being in a chorus line if you are not going to be kicking in the same level as the people left and right of you. The only person who was allowed to deviate in the chorus line was the final person. At the end of the chorus line, there would be one person who could make mistakes, who could goof it up, and that person actually used to always be Josephine Baker when she was in the chorus line. So that was all obviously ironic contrast. Again, we can talk about that later, but in general, it only serves to heighten the fact that the chorus line is supposed to be perfectly coordinated. And there are some quotes there from Siegfried Krakauer, who has a very interesting essay on the mass ornament. Again, I advise everyone to read it, in which he discusses the chorus line as this kind of an affirmation of a process of rationalization. Gramsci talks about it too, this kind of intensification of rhythm. Basically, it seems that there is a trap that rhythm sets for the modern subject, and in all its euphoria, nevertheless is present in our lives. Now, Modern Times then seems to be a satire precisely on that trap. It's a bit tragic too, because the subject of capitalist modernity in Modern Times tries his best to escape with comic but often grim consequences. And the only moment, I think, in the film that offers a glimmer of hope is, interestingly, a moment of improvisation. Let's just see a bit of this. And in this clip, actually, you can see a lot of the influences that Charlie Chaplin took from vaudeville and all the same sources that fed in a different line into the Lindy Hop. So it's a shared inheritance, really. Tap dance and so on. So he's been asked by his partner there, you better go out and do something. Dance, sing, do whatever. You've got to entertain. So it's an act of desperation. By the way, these steps are straight from the Black Bottom, which was a very, kind of powerfully, sort of after the Charleston became very popular, just before the Lindy Hop. And Modern Times is a silent film, but this is the only time we hear something in Charlie Chaplin's voice. Basically, it's complete nonsense. Some kind of half-digested attempts to sing in Italian, but... Okay. We get the idea again. So, I got some quotes there about how there was this, this desire at the same time to imagine that the collective work, the worker engaged in the collective in this repetitive rhythm could somehow break into dance, could somehow rechannel their energies into something less debilitating again than the cramp of time. And improvisation, again, as we see here, is somehow seen also. There's a kind of instinct towards improvisation, which this clip, I think, embodies and tries to articulate. But the whole point is that he's struggling. He doesn't have the words. He makes things up. And does it succeed? Well, that's the whole point. There seems then... There is, on the one hand, a utopian hope amongst a left-leaning set of intellectuals that dance itself can offer a way out of the cramp of our tempo, which is the entrapment of the subject by factory rhythm. But the point is, where does one turn to in order to learn that which has been forgotten? Where are the words? And so we can return to Dane and her observations on jazz dance's basis in rhythm and improvisation to understand that is why it is in this kind of dance that she can see the antidote to this cramp of our tempo. The improvisational quality of jazz dance returns unpredictability to the frame of time, while another non-linear conception of time takes over. This experience of temporality immerses the body in another relationship to the march of time by engaging in a conversation with what Eurocentric musicology terms polyrhythm and syncopation. Basically, syncopation is a term that European-centered musicology uses to talk about deviation from a certain time signature. But if deviation itself is the basis of your time signature, then the word syncopation makes no sense. So that's why it's a bit of a Eurocentric use, but since we are trapped in language, we have to use some words, so we are using it. But, so there are other ways of interpreting and moving in time, and these are the features of jazz dance and music, which derive from that Africanist inheritance. Interestingly, though, of course, they are also features that first found expression in the New World, in the Americas, on the plantation. And I think this is the slide that should have come before that. Sorry, a bit of improvisation on my part. But this is really what I wanted to, the point I want to make at this moment, that before the factory, there was the plantation, and that was where the body was first pressed into somebody else's temporality to deliver the goods, literally, and was deprived of subjectivity as a result. And that was precisely also the place where drumming, dancing, and movement, just the resources of the body, pure and simple, were used to form resistance. And this is that resistance to what Achille Mbembe has called necropolitics. And in his essay on necropolitics, he does have that very telling phrase. He talks about the slave on the plantation, and he says, something like, I paraphrase, stylized gestures. That was all that the slave had. But the point is, the stylization, Mbembe's problem, I greatly admire him, but he again reduces the kinetic possibilities of movement. So when you say stylized gestures, you just have a freeze frame. We want to unpack the stylized gesture into that and reinsert it into another temporality. So Dane's interlocutors, the African-American dancers that she talks to and interviews and records, time and again remember the plantation. The cakewalk, for instance, they remember as formed through mimicry by slaves of white masters. That is the genealogy that is enshrined in their collective memory, and they make her aware of it through their constant explications of how jazz dance came to be. They don't let her forget it. Thus, jazz, both dance and music, manifests the memory of original resistance to the time of labor by codifying those temporalities into its formal properties. Hence, what, in fact, Dane quotes Armstrong as calling jazz the freedom music, the spasm music. What is a spasm? Obviously, that's that uncontrolled body, supposedly, because it's unpredictable and you think it's a spasm, but in a second it's going to become a Lindy Hop step. You didn't know that before that moment was to pass. So it's true, though, that spasm music can become subject to different kinds of reifications. This is what Fred Moten, in his amazing book, Into the Break, it's on jazz music, he calls the dichotomy between the graphic and the kinetic. So the kinetic is that which moves, including music, because music also is made out of movement and is of the moment. But the minute it gets engraved, literally, into some kind of recording, it becomes graphic. So it becomes fixed and it can become reified. So music can become reified through different means of technological capture, but the dancing body, that's why we need dance, that's why we need jazz dance, not just jazz music. It brings that protean quality back into the picture and resists reification. So it's only through the spasmodic, jerking, but vital body on the new Dionysian collective of the dance hall floor that we can be released then from the cramp of our tempo and the dangers of reification that face even the music that accompanied that dance because of its amenability to technological capture. These embodied kinetic resources that are folded into jazz dance are what captivated the white observers, such as Dane, and made them finally appreciate what she calls the precious gifts of Africa, which were precisely that which were not appreciated, rather completely opposite, on the plantation. But let me end now by asking, what does this fact of the gift of Africa make jazz? Is jazz a shining example of African retention? To be sharply opposed to the European privileging of logos, let us see a little bit to end of her film, The Spirit Moves, as we consider this question. What she did in The Spirit Moves is she got the best dancers from Harlem and put them in a studio in this white space. And the music was, this is technology, the limitations of technology at that time. It's not the music to which they were dancing. It's similar, but it's not what they were dancing to. And I really want us to think about how she's presenting this dance as collective memory. Sometimes, of course, there is footage, but this is the dominant mode of the film's presentation. And I want us to think about this issue of the gift of Africa. Is jazz, an example of the African myth that says in the beginning was the rhythm, etc.? Or is it an example of the way in which Europe and Africa are forever intertwined in this uncomfortable yet necessary embrace? This is the final question that I want us to end with. But I'm going to just keep there some of her quotes about, again, rhythm and reclaiming the gifts of Africa, just there as we ponder this issue here. So this kind of romanticism, the gift of Africa, is of course a tricky path to go down, thinking about the intertwining of Europe and Africa in jazz. And even when Dane makes these declarations, one must ask, what does it mean for jazz to say that Europe and Africa are forever intertwined? What does it mean to say that jazz derives from the gifts of Africa? In technical terms, the statement does remind us of what the Lindy Hoppers themselves constantly reminded Dane about. The roots of jazz dance are also to be found in European dances, such as the polka and the waltz. They said that all the time to her. And they are to be found in those European dances as much as the Africanist aesthetics that Brenda Dixon Gottschalk enumerates in her work of digging out the Africanist presence in North American vernacular dance, which I, quoted for you as well. We went through some of those bullet points. So obviously, we see jazz dance as indeed some kind of intertwining, but I think that we need a new vocabulary. We need to assess it in a way we take some kind of step away from how perhaps Dane was talking about it to kind of reconsider the whole phenomenon. So I would say that I see jazz dance as an example of what I'm now calling a creolized couple dance, where creolization signals the creation of something new from older cultural materials. And actually in my research, I've found that these dances are occurring also on the other side of the Atlantic in Africa. So it's not just a New World thing, except that the dances that formed in the New World became transnationalized and commercialized in different ways. This is what I think perhaps the word creolization is useful for, to signal this kind of category of a new cultural formation from older materials, and which arises, most importantly, perhaps, in response to certain needs and conditions that are common to modernity. Now, this is, if we replace Europe and Africa with white and black, we can also see how this question returns us to the complicated issue of white folks watching black dance and the long history of love and theft, in Eric Lott's words, that today we are probably more apt to label cultural appropriation. But as I said, I hope to have opened out through quoting Dane's own words and going back to that moment where jazz dance exploded in the world, that there are more complex issues of nostalgia, melancholia, being subject equally to the cramp of time, and looking for ways out of it that perhaps can draw us together in a shared exploration of certain gifts, however difficult those gifts might have been in their arrival and their making. The difficulty of self-positioning makes Dane literally abstract her dancers from their context and put them in a white space in her film, the film that finally got made at the end of her life, The Spirit Moves. But I do believe that jazz dance retains still today its potential for reclaiming space and time through the performance of the urban. And had a very nice quote from Brenda Dixon Gottschalk about jazz in the city, where she starts a book by talking about herself moving to the rhythms of jazz, like, for example, the famous song, Take the A Train, while she's in the subway and so on. But I think it's also another telling work, which is much more recent and is a work of fiction, which most of us perhaps have at least heard of, if not read, is Zadie Smith's Swing Time, which I also find quite fascinatingly engaging with many of these same issues through taking us back to that moment of jazz dance. And I'm just going to end here with a few quotes, which I will just read out, and then we can open up for discussion. So, for example, she talks a lot about Fred Astaire in her book Swing Time, and Fred Astaire, of course, was a white appropriator, if you want to call him that, of tap dance and other black vernacular forms. If Fred Astaire represented the aristocracy, that is the speaker, the narrator of Swing Time, I represented the proletariat. Oh, sorry, this is Gene Kelly who said that. And by this logic, Bill Bojangles Robinson should really have been my dancer. That's the narrator, sorry. Because Bojangles, who was, by the way, one of the very famous Harlem Lindy Hopper dancers, because Bojangles danced for the Harlem dandy, for the ghetto kid, for the sharecropper, for all the descendants of slaves. And here you can see the collapse again of time, a linear time. of history. But to me, a dancer was a man from nowhere, without parents or siblings, without a nation or people, without obligations of any kind, and that was exactly the quality I loved. A great dancer, she says, soon thereafter that quote, has no time, no generation. She's actually talking about Michael Jackson here. He moves eternally. She imagines Fred Astaire going and learning the moonwalk from Michael Jackson. And she says, he moves eternally through the world so that any dancer in any age may recognize him. Picasso would be incomprehensible to Rembrandt, but Nijinsky would understand Michael Jackson. And finally, as she says elsewhere in the book, black music, white music, there must be a world somewhere in which the two combined. And I would say that is the moment of a good dance. Thank you very much.
Sorry.
I hope we have time for a few questions at least. I know it's gone over a bit, but...
Thank you very, very much, Ananya. That was absolutely superb, and it was wonderful. And I think we should all read very, very carefully what you say. We have 10 minutes, I think.
That's nice. That's good.
Before the next session. Are there any questions that you would like to ask? Yes?
Well, thank you so much for that really engaging presentation. I think I could listen to you for 2 more hours. And I apologize in advance because my question is a little, maybe a little too specific, but I really like the Simmel quote that you used. Was it from Metropolis and Mental Life? Or?
Yeah. It was a quote, actually, to be perfectly honest, it is from that book, but it was quoted in another book, so I really must go back to the original context. The book that quoted it was a book on the waltz in Vienna, which I was rereading for this talk, which is called The Sounds of the Metropolis or something. So in this book, which is really about the Viennese waltz, which is quite important for my genealogy, this quote from Simmel is used, but it is from the work that you're talking about. And obviously one needs to go back and, kind of reread it properly.
But then but I think maybe, so in the Metropolis and Mental Life, he also talks about how, in the big city, he uses this curious term, you need to develop a blasé attitude to be able to ignore half of what's going on around you, to focus on what's going on. And I was wondering whether that tied in with what you said about, for example, the Lindy Hop, that you need to focus on the rhythm, but then again, it's kind of this openness to perceive a lot of things at the same time. So I was kind of, I wonder whether that ties
Well, it's
in
a really good gloss. When I go back to the original to read it, I'm going to obviously be alert to those. It doesn't seem to me surprising that he would use such a formulation which would remind us of something that's going on later in another very specific time and place where we are talking about another genealogy, we would imagine. But that's my point, that, also the waltz, the circumstances in which the waltz developed in Vienna and became a very democratic dance is quite important. So, those feelings about the city, which allows certain dance practices to become, demotic, are really repeating themselves in different scenarios very quickly in this 50-year period, from the birth of the waltz to around the time we're talking about. And so it's part of a global understanding of what the city allows you. But what is not global is a different attitude to rhythm. And that's really where Muradin is able to capture something and bring it to the table.
Thank you so much.
And thanks for, insisting that I go back to the original of that, which I will, of course. Thanks.
Yes, here's another question.
Thank you, that was really fascinating. And like I said before, I could listen to way more of that. And it was really great also to see these representations of dance. And I liked how you picked up on utopianism in jazz dance and how that's kind of reflected through the kind of representations that you've shown here today. Very early on, you used a quotation that mentioned my own land, and immediately I thought of La La Land, which is, obviously has been quite controversial. And I was just thinking about contrasting that with the kind of representations of jazz dance that you've got here, and kind of thinking of Zadie Smith as well.
Yeah.
What do you think about not dance itself and the utopianism within jazz dance, but the utopianism in the representations of jazz dance?
Yeah.
Particularly now in a kind of nostalgic pattern. So if you could speak to that, maybe.
Of course, yeah, because when I saw La La Land, I also was thinking of Swing Time and all this stuff. So it was really pretty much the same train of thought that you've outlined for us here. And I kept thinking, why do people want to use jazz dance, and why there's a particular moment again where the issues of authenticity are debated again through the black musicians. There's the whole discussion about, don't sell your soul to capitalism, don't become something else. But he's becoming something else because his friend who's black is insisting that come and join us, and they become commercialized. So it's all a bit kind of a bit confusing from the point of view of a stereotyped line that you want to draw about who's authentic, who has the secret, who do we look to save ourselves, from this continuing obsession with certain malaises of our times. I think La La Land, actually, the end also saved me because, it wasn't like a happy ending where the two kind of rejoined, and, so there was a kind of little bit of unpicking of certain saccharine tropes that would seal the moment in. So I have to see the film again to really rethink this, but that's what I thought. It was redeemed somehow at the end by what it didn't do. And Zadie Smith's book I also find very interesting because, again, it's got a lot of stuff going on, but I think she also, she doesn't get into the dance. She's always like talking about the dance. She's always the spectator watching the dance, literally, and she's dying to get into the dance. She even goes to Africa all the way to get into the dance, and she still can't find the dance. So it's a typical writerly trap that she falls into, I'm afraid there. But she's got a very ongoing, long engagement with African-American forms, spiritual as well as secular forms. I mean, her book on beauty with the whole engagement there, Zuli and Voodoo, was quite exciting, So it's a conversation she's having in her head, clearly, and we'll have to see where it goes. It's a work in progress. But all these forms of dance are, I think, inherently from the perspective of the dancer, we are in the now. When you're dancing it, it's presentist. There can be no future, there can be no, and when Muradin talks about time and the jazz dancers tell her about time, they talk about, we have to be here in the beat now. But it's very interesting, the minute you step out of the dance, you fall prey to nostalgia. The dance becomes your mode to look back and forward, and that's utopianism, you're looking forward. Nostalgia looking backward. So there's a constant dialogue going on with temporality, meta-temporality, I would say. But the way to get out of it is to get into the dance. Mm-hmm. But that's the problem with us as literary critics. Mm-hmm. There is a barrier of ekphrases, of words getting in the way. So we can only just try and do it ourselves and be aware of those barriers. And
thank you.
May I ask a question, because it picks up with your question? Ananya, have you come across any groups, ethnic, cultural groups, that don't dance at all? I mean, I know that there are many religions which demonize dance because, of course, with the loss of body control, you can also become too revolutionary. And the controlled body is part of a reaction to very dictatorships, totalitarian states. And I'm thinking of very, very puritanical societies, where you are not allowed to express your body at all. So dance and politics are
very much so. I mean, I hesitate to take a very universalist view because then, one can talk about anything and everything. But stepping out of the scholarly mode and just as a human being, one can indeed say, perhaps, I hope that, like language, there's a universalist impulse to move, to rhythm, to make music, to dance. And books, I find Jacques Attali's Political Economy of Noise really important because it reminds us of that ritualistic dimension of music and dance that, goes into different, dissipates in different ways as we move into what we know of, understand, and experience as modernity. So they may just, I mean, human beings, there's always ways in which some human beings try to control other human beings. They proscribe sex, they proscribe contact, they proscribe, anything and everything. So, of course, anything that's joyous, exhilarating, and gives you happiness is going to be suspect, because of some people don't want others to just, be themselves. It's again, I'm not speaking academically here, I'm just speaking philosophically and as a human being. So I think those are impulses that formulate every social kind of dynamic. I wouldn't say that any one group steals a march over another one. It just depends on time and, history and historical concatenation of forces. But certainly, I would say that I don't think there's any society that doesn't dance, and I don't think there's any society that thinks dance is innocuous. So,
okay. There's some Fran there and Francis. Sorry, this gentleman.
No, I think we'd like
and
your
Francis.
Okay.
Okay.
No.
Shall I ask my question first?
No.
Okay.
My
question was about swing time as well. Sorry to bring Sadie Smith up again. Because she completely ruined, in a good way, Meet Me in St. Louis for me. In that particular moment when she imagines Margaret O'Brien and Judy Garland doing the cakewalk. So my question was about appropriation, but also cultural amnesia, because in the film they do the cakewalk without any blackface or anything. It could be interpreted as this kind of Americana kind of dance. But what Smith is doing is bringing to the surface that kind of appropriation, saying, well, these two characters are doing a black dance and appropriating a black dance. So do you think there's a kind of insidious way of appropriating black culture that is brought to mainstream society and makes people forget about that colonial history and that history of slavery?
Well, that's again a constant, what can I say? That relationship between different forms of black expressive culture. I'm just talking about North America at the moment because the story is different in other parts, of the continent. So just because that's what swing time is also concerned about. It's very constitutive of North American culture, and it's very constitutive, therefore, of modernity, because that culture then was just generally marketed and consumed all over the world. So I don't think at the moment there's any dance, any popular dance or musical form coming out of the Americas that is not indebted to the black presence. So what do we do with that? All of us should stop dancing and listening to music? Or no, we can all become more vigilant and pay more attention to that history and try to understand what was it that made it what it was, that made it this wellspring of popular cultural expression. Unfortunately, always involved. When do things come to a flashpoint? It's when money is involved. Commodification, commercialization, who's getting the benefits that capitalism bestows on subjects through this cultural inheritance. And usually the problem is that you see it's the white people who have got those benefits. So that is the problem, I would say, in a philosophical way and an economical way. So when cultural appropriation, in my opinion, becomes an issue precisely when we see that those benefits of capitalism are not equitably flowing back to the sources of that culture. And Mira Dane makes it quite clear she wants to, she's aware of that and she wants to redress it. That's why she's uncomfortable and she's wavering between, is this like we all wanted, but what is it? But her interlocutors cannot let her forget the plantation. So that's important too. Who do you talk to and what's their role in reminding you and of therefore putting a break against amnesia? And I think Zadie Smith is struggling with these issues herself, and the book is a struggle. I don't think anything is resolved, but she definitely, she talks also about when the first section, the first, the foreword or the prologue of the book, when she says, she goes to the BFI, she sees a film to get out of whatever his problem, the big problem that she's in, which we don't understand about till later. And she says she saw this old Fred Astaire film and then suddenly she realized that he was in blackface. I mean, she herself had not realized that. So she plays with the absence and presence of blackface too, I think. That's another whole conversation. But in my opinion, that's the issue, that the cultural appropriation should be looked at from that angle of, I mean, it's a problem that arises precisely because of acknowledgement as well as the economic, dimensions, which of course, because we are in a capitalist economy, we have to be, cognizant of.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Francis.
Thanks so much. Okay, so I have two things. One, you were mostly talking about time, but I couldn't help but think about space.
Of course, yeah. Yeah, please.
As you were talking. So for instance, you mentioned the plantation, you mentioned the factory, we have Josephine Baker in Paris. So we're talking about unprecedented mobilizations,
yes.
Fueled in part by Black desire. And if we think about how the Great Migration from the South to the North, there were enormous efforts by authorities and capital to keep African Americans in the South and not allow them literally to get out of the South so they could continue serving as cheap labor for that economy. So I guess question one is that what is the place of space in your argument of time?
Yeah.
And I guess the second thing is it's so evident that this moment is also a moment where everything's getting disrupted by the rise of capturing technologies like cinema.
Yes.
And it becomes very disruptive to the argument of embodiment in some way, not in a negative sense, but in the sense that changes everything, because when you are dancing for another that's present in a space, it's totally different than when you're dancing, like in the film, you're dancing for a camera for disembodied viewers that you don't know wherever they are. So I was wondering also if you can comment that this is a moment not only of unprecedented movement and occupation of space by Blacks in New York, but it's also a moment of great paradoxes. It's not embodiment versus capital.
No.
It's with capital, inside capital, alongside capital, and with the rise of image, as opposed to a certain kind of chronotrope of space and time. So I just wondered if you could talk about one of those two things or both things.
Well, I wish I could talk about all of them, but I'm also cognizant of our time passing. So I'll just say that obviously, space and time have to be tackled together, ideally, because you're absolutely right. It's not just an abstraction. It's a historical reality that none of all this would have even come about were it not for the big movement, the massive migrations that started with the Middle Passage, and also with the movement of Europeans of different kinds to the Americas. So everybody's on the move. This is a music and dance coming out of movement. And then we have the final, or at this point, the penultimate migration up to the north of the African American groups you're talking about. So I think that space must come into the story when we are kind of rendering a historical account, of course. I mean, in this very kind of synoptic talk, I was trying to focus on time, but the challenge will definitely be to integrate, I think, that interest in theorizing and counter-theorizing time with the spatialization of it. I mean, funnily enough, the quote from Lukács, which is up there, is actually talking about time becoming space, but in the context that we're trying to militate against, So I would have to play with that a bit. In a nutshell, I would say that as a tool to constantly remind ourselves of those issues of technological capture that you are alluding to, I think of the dance floor as a space which is kind of, it sounds a bit woozy, but I want to call it like trans-historical in the sense that it's a space that occupies different historical moments and but has the same kind of, it can actually almost in a way, what can I say, reenact certain physiological effects like sweating, for example, just to take one, like the sweat of the plantation can reappear as the sweat of the dance floor. The contact that was enforced can also become another kind of contact on the dance floor, etc. So I find the dance floor as a very important way to think about space in the overall argument that I'm proposing. And that's the way I kind of also would argue. I would hope to find the dancing body in that space and that moment, to go back to this idea of presentism, as resisting, not resisting overtly, but dancing in spite of and in the face of any kind of technological capture that can be going on, So the very presence, it sounds very simplistic, but for me that's the basic, the very fact that when we look at a dance floor and we think about that, what's going on there, that's the way I would say space and time can come together in another way of making us rethink technological capture and all its implications.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm afraid we have to stop here. I'm very, very sorry, but we have another session coming right now. And so I'll stop with dancing in spite of, and which is a lovely phrase, Ananya, and thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.